Good evening. I'm Casey Nolan. Welcome to Stay Tuned. You know, in many ways, the problems our children face are no different than their parents, but those problems have evolved. Bullying is now online. Drugs are easier to get. Abuse, neglect, homelessness all persist. Tonight on Stay Tuned, we are talking about the mental health of our youth and how we can all help. So stay tuned. We're bringing in reinforcements this week on Stay Tuned. Jim Kircher with the 9 Network is here to help us kind of dive in and go even deeper. Thank you, Jim, for being here. We appreciate the extra help.
Yeah, you know, it's Mental Health Month, and also really we got to think of this as Tornado Awareness Month. You're just back from Oklahoma,
right,
and you deal with these issues. Every time you hear these stories reported, you start talking about the counseling that's needed, the recovery, the things that, the burdens of loss, of trauma and all of that. Now, naturally, when you were there, immediately it was rescuing people and stuff,
right,
but I imagine those issues of counseling are already beginning to come up.
And we're talking about youth, and everyone knows who's followed this story, the kids are a big part of it. Absolutely. Shock and trauma are central themes of what's going on in Moore, Oklahoma right now, for sure. And the parents and the students and the teachers, rather, who are there with a lot of those children at the time, you know, they are having to take care of themselves and each other, and at the same time trying to carry the burdens for these kids. Today for Channel 5, we talked to a school counselor who survived the tornado in one of the elementary schools that was hit with, you know, she was laying on top of children. She was crying. She said at the time, one of the kids looked up at her and said, "Don't cry, it's going to be okay." So, you know, she's talking about the resilience of the children, but at the same time, you know, how do you go forward? There's a lot of unanswered questions for those folks.
And we've got a lot of experts tonight to talk about all kinds of trauma and loss and what some of those things. I think it's easiest for us to understand something terrible like that.
Right.
Some of the other things that I think we're going to talk about tonight are a little more subtle than that.
Absolutely. There is a lot of trauma in this world for our youth that has nothing to do with a camera from CNN and a telethon to raise money.
And I have to ask, you've covered a lot of stuff. Have you ever seen that kind of destruction?
In Joplin.
Yeah.
And some of the same mental health issues after that.
And they're still dealing with that.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So we'll talk about that tonight.
All right, Jim, we're looking forward to it. Thank you for being here. Let's start it off with you, though. Let's go to social media to see what you're already saying about tonight's conversation. All right, we're getting our conversation tonight started with a couple of folks who can help us with that and get us going in the right direction. Dr. Bart Andrews, Vice President of Clinical Operations, Behavioral Health Response, and Dr. Megan Schock, Clinical Manager, Children's Advocacy Services. Thank you both for being here. And I think I want to pick up first on what Jim and I were just talking about. You know, it's easy to see trauma when a child is being carried out by a teacher from a tornado. But it goes well beyond that. Like we just said, it doesn't have to be in the national spotlight. In fact, the vast majority of mental health trauma and issues are not. What can you help us lay the groundwork here on what other things we should be concerned about?
Well, we know that to 60% of kids actually experience some sort of traumatic event.
Say that again. I want to make sure we get that. 60?
60% of kids experience some sort of exposure to violence or a traumatic event. So that's a significant number of our population that's experiencing, whether it's a tornado in Oklahoma, whether it's witnessing violence in their neighborhood, whether it's child maltreatment, or whether it's violence in their home. And the other piece that goes along with this is once a child has experienced one incident of violence, their likelihood of experiencing another incident of violence increases significantly. So once they've experienced one incident of violence, there's almost a 70% chance of experiencing another incident of violence. So that puts them at even more risk of then not only then having then the fallout of the mental health problems that potentially go along with it.
1 in 5 we just saw on the screen could be diagnosed with a mental health problem of some kind.
So we know that at least 20% of our youth are experiencing symptoms of a disorder. We know that less than a quarter of those are getting diagnosed and treated. So there's a huge gap between the number of folks that are experiencing, our youth that are experiencing a problem, and how many folks are young folks that we're identifying and able to reach out and help. And in terms of the trauma, it's really key when we see this horrific event that's happened in Oklahoma, and the youth and those families are experiencing this shock. That shock is normalized, it's visible. So people know this horrible thing has happened to you, so there's a shared element. So the community is able to support them. There's a community outreaching. But for most of our youth that experience a trauma, it's hidden. Only a few people, or sometimes only that youth, knows about that trauma. So not only are they facing this burden that they're bearing, but they're feeling alone in that. And it isn't normalized. So, because the reactions that we're seeing are really normal reactions. And in a group event, even though it is horrible for them, people can rely on each other and see that this is a normal reaction, what we're going through. But a youth that experiences a trauma, often they're by themselves and they don't know that what they're going through, and that reaction is a really normal reaction to what's happened.
Do they react differently than adults, whether it be the highly visible or not?
They react in different systems. So they may react in the same way as in experiencing sadness, experiencing anxiety, but because they're in a school environment, because they're within their family, and because they have parents telling them, you got to get up in the morning and you got to go to school. You know, as grown-ups, if you're having a bad day, you may decide to stay home from work and not get out of bed that day. But kids, their parents are dragging them out of bed and taking them to school. So instead what we may see are temper tantrums. And so what we may be interpreting and thinking about their behavior might be different than what we might be thinking about adults. We may be thinking of that as a kind of oppositional and they're badly behaving kids, but really what might be going on in the inside is that they're really kind of sad and they have a lot of other emotional underlying symptoms going on there. So it might look different on the outside because of what's going on for them, but kind of the underlying features are often quite similar.
Do we need to define mental health before we get going too far tonight?
And I think that's really important. It's a good question that you bring up, because we use the term mental health and we're often talking about mental disorders as opposed to mental health. Mental health is really about the health and the well-being of our children, that they are in fact progressing, they're meeting developmental milestones in terms of how they think, how they feel, how they behave, that they're doing well and experiencing a good life at home, at school, in their community. A mental disorder is the exact opposite of that. A mental disorder is when there is a serious deviation in how they're developing in terms of their emotions or their thinking or their behavior, and that deviation meets criteria for some sort of a diagnosis. So people use the term mental health and mental disorder interchangeably, but they're two very different things, and there's some real consequences for focusing on one and not the other. If we just focus on mental health and well-being, we miss all of these folks that have a true disorder and that are struggling. And if we focus too much on the disordered side of the issue, we're not focusing all the preventive things and all the things we can do to enrich our children's lives and make them more resilient, so when things do happen or they experience bumps in the road, that they're able to overcome those. So we've got two sides of that coin.
Well, so for example, these kids in Oklahoma who just experienced this traumatic event, we may see a dip in their mental health. They may have some difficulties, which may be perfectly natural. They just experienced a significant traumatic event. A lot of them may bounce back with some support. They may bounce back because of their natural resiliency, because of their supportive caregivers. Some may continue to slide because of what was going on in their life beforehand, because of natural biological predisposition towards mental illness, and then they may get to the point where they have a mental illness and need even more support to be able to get back to a good level of functioning.
Dr. Megan Schacht, thank you very much. Dr. Bart Andrews, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Let's go back to social media to see what you're saying.
I'm hoping we can get to maybe some practical advice. Kira Hudson Banks, St. Louis University psychology professor, Dan Duncan from the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, and Marion McCord from CHADS Coalition, which deals with issues of adolescent depression, suicide. You've got a personal story we want to ask you about in just a bit. But let me ask you this. I mean, a lot of people, me included, have had moody teenagers. There seems to be a lot of things, and maybe moody middle school students, and maybe kids with tantrums. And so the question, I think, is, as a parent, becomes what's normal behavior that's okay, and what warning signs would begin to tell you that this isn't just normal behavior? Kara, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a way in which we have to also allow kids a spectrum of behaviors, right? They're moody adults as well, people that we work
Right.
with, right? But I think some risk factors to be aware of are when your child is really isolating themselves, right? When they have something that they love to do and they no longer have an interest in engaging in it, right? So that activity or that friend that you knew might spark their interest no longer does. You should start to be concerned. If they're sleeping too much, or if they're not sleeping enough, if their appetite is hyperactive, or they don't have one at all, right? Those are all signs of depression, right? Which is where we would start to see some serious possible suicidal ideation.
Yeah, Dan, you know, alcoholism and drug abuse, what you're dealing with, that to me can exist as its own disease, its own problem, maybe separate. I'm not sure where this fits in for us, because we've been taught for a long time, well, addiction is a disease or alcoholism is a disease, but is it a mental health issue, or is it a symptom of something, or maybe it's all of those things?
It can be either or both. Sometimes we call it co-occurring disorders, where the precursor to alcohol and drug use is really depression, anxiety, something along those lines, a personality disorder. For that youth, when they discover or they experiment with something like alcohol or marijuana, it may do something different for them than it does the next kid. And
So it can set something off.
Oh yeah,
or
absolutely.
It could be a
They're
symptom of the problem.
self-medicating,
Right.
essentially, because it's making them feel better when there's a deficit and there's something that there's a reason they're trying to feel better. As a result, they will continue using and perhaps use more and more frequently than the next kid, and that can parlay right into an addiction over time.
Mm-hmm. Marion, you're dealing with, you dealt with this in your own family with your own son, and now you're helping other people deal with it. But for me, it's the scariest story, because you were not unaware of what was going on with CHAD, for whom this organization is named. You were aware. Tell us a little bit about what you went through, and then how you're trying to share this with other people.
Chad was one of those cream of the crop students. He just seemingly had it all. And ironically, I was a pediatric nurse. I was in the business of saving children's lives. I had no idea that he was fighting depression. until it was his senior year. After a long phone conversation with his girlfriend, he told her on the phone that he wanted to take his life. And she did exactly what she was supposed to do and called us, and Chad talked to us, and I'm a pediatric nurse, and I said, Chad sounds like he's suffering from depression. That was the beginning of the journey for us, and it was for 6 months that she trialed him on 17 different medications. He went through ECT. Chad was unusual in that he was also 100% compliant with his treatment. He did not abuse drugs and alcohol, and he really wanted to get better. But he had a treatment-resistant depression. So it was 6 months after he told us that he wanted to take his life, that he did take his life. It was 2 weeks after he got his Eagle Award, and 4 weeks before graduating with high honors.
And this cuts across, again, I know we've made this point when we've talked about these issues before, that these problems and the vast array of problems cut across all groups, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic.
They do. You find it all throughout society, and I think sometimes a natural tendency for some families, parents, is to assume it's just a phase, whatever they're seeing, and that this will pass. And the stigma comes into play a little bit there, I think, in terms of nobody wants to have that necessarily going on in their family. But it's very important to do what Marion did, which is to respond and hopefully have a better outcome, because the earlier the response, the earlier their intervention, generally speaking, the better the reception for the child.
And I really think, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I'm so inspired that you're willing to reach and help others, because it's important that people, like you said, it knows no boundaries, in a sense that I think people often, and parents, don't want to say, or want to say, it couldn't happen to my child because they are a student and because they're involved in so many extracurriculars, and that's not a guarantee that they won't suffer from a mental illness.
So where are the barriers? I mean, what are the challenges here? I mean, okay, I get it if somebody's choosing to ignore it, but I think we've improved the stigma. I think you've shown over the years, to some extent, you're maybe not agreeing, but I think there's a greater awareness. But the barriers, whether it's a barrier personally for you or in the things that you're seeing, what's preventing things from working?
Well, historically, I mean, one of the barriers that we've had was a lack of services, insurance reimbursement, whether they would pay for it or not, whether you can get the help. That is getting better. In the county, we were fortunate that we passed the Children's Service Fund a few years ago, and now lots of money is starting to flow into much needed services that are making a difference and will continue to make a difference. So we're fortunate. Not all areas have that, but we do have to confront those issues in terms of available services for kids when they need them, and the quicker that we can connect them to what they need, get a diagnosis if necessary. I mean, that's really critical and very important.
Marion, do you find stigma to still be there?
Absolutely. I think that is a huge part. I mean, kids want to be like other kids. And so many of our youth are masters of disguise. We can talk about what the symptoms are, but they will do their best to hide them because they just want to be like their peers.
And I think, to be honest, there are adults who are not honest about the symptoms they have as well, right? So we have in our society this kind of rugged individualism. I can do it, right? And I can do it by myself. And I think that gets in our way as a society. And so if kids are seeing that in the adults and then mirroring it, it looks weak to say that you need help.
Dan, best piece of advice you can give somebody who thinks there might be an issue in their family?
Kind of like I was just saying, take action soon. Don't wait. Don't assume that it's going to go away on its own. React. Get some help. Get some professional help. Reach out, and do it as soon as your gut tells you. You know, this is persistent. We're seeing accumulation of symptoms here, not one thing or two, and it's getting worse. Do not wait. Reach out, get help.
And we've made the point before, the resources to a great extent are out there, and sometimes it's just getting people connected to what's already available to them as opposed to things that are not there. I know people, this is the sort of thing I think people would be thinking about, commenting, having a lot of their own personal things to say about this. We're going to go to Ed to find out what the social media folks are chiming in on. Ed?
Thanks, Jim. Well, I'm the one actually here that's interacting with you on Facebook and while you're tweeting us, and you've been doing a great job already. In fact, many of your comments are helping frame this evening's show here, and already we've been hearing, just from a question we posed on our Facebook page, how age affects people coping with situations, and we're already hearing on that Facebook page and on Twitter that age plays a big role. For example, one young youth member said they have to make a decision between getting a better grade or getting a good night's sleep, and that stresses that person out. So we want you to join in the conversation. You see on the screen the hashtag StayTunedSTL. Join in the conversation. Use the hashtag. Let's see what you're already saying.
All right, let's go outside of the studio to Yale University via the Google Hangout to talk to Dr. Mark Brackett, the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And first, doctor, let me say thanks for coming back to the show. We appreciate it. This is your second time on. And first, I'll ask you, what do you see being done across the country to address the issues we just heard about, access, stigma, other things that are preventing folks from getting what they need?
So, the approach that we take at our center is that every child really deserves an education in social and emotional skills. And we're part of a network of educators and policymakers who really are pushing for the whole education of a child. And so the field of social and emotional learning was really born to make sure that every child gets that education.
When does that education have to start? We've talked on Stay Tuned about starting young with our kids when it comes to nutrition and the fight against obesity. When does that education that you're talking about need to start?
So, I make a joke, it has to start in the womb, but in all seriousness, we like to start as early as possible. The work we do at our center now begins around age 3 in preschool. And our goal is to have this education be continuous across the lifespan.
And is this something that a professional needs to do, or is this something a parent can impart?
So the work that we are involved in really is in schools, because we can guarantee, that 99.9% of all children are in school at least for 6 to 8 hours a day, and we can give them that sort of standardized emotion education.
So can you give us a little glimpse of what that education is like? What do you mean by that?
So what we mean by that is we want to teach children a set of skills. The skills that we work on are the ability to recognize the emotions they're experiencing, have them be able to understand why they're having those feelings, giving them the vocabulary so that they can really differentiate the feeling of sadness from disappointment or anger from frustration, as well as positive emotions. Also teach them how to express themselves in a healthy way, and very importantly, I think for all of us, are the strategies to regulate emotions.
How important is it for the teacher, if you will, to have these skills?
From our perspective, it's really critical for the adults who teach children to have the skills that they're teaching. So in our model of bringing emotional intelligence to schools, we really work with leaders first, then teachers, and students and their families after.
We were kind of talking about the tornado here in the Midwest earlier tonight, and it's who couldn't get behind a child who has survived a tornado? That's something that everyone gets on board with. Is it a little harder? Does people shy away on a personal level sometimes of getting involved in a child's mental health?
I think they do, because they haven't been taught the skills they need to interact effectively with children. So that's why our approach really is about developing the adults first, so that they have the emotion vocabulary to speak to children, that they have the strategies that they can model and then teach to children.
So what are kids doing to cope? I'm sure, whether they're taught or not, they're going to do something, either good or bad.
Of course, there are effective strategies and ineffective strategies. We know a lot of kids, when they're traumatized or when they're in pain, ruminate. A kid who's being bullied is just ruminating all day. How am I going to get home safely? How am I going to get to this class without being hurt? Or in a traumatic situation like you're talking about, they're ruminating about their own homes and their families, where we want to try to teach kids to use techniques like positive self-talk or what we call positive reappraisal, where they can change the storyline to help them cope more effectively.
So how do kids make for students in this area? Are these skills that they can pick up fairly easily?
We believe they are, as long as they're taught effectively and they're practiced. So you need to practice these skills and get feedback and catch yourself, right? So when I'm ruminating about something that's really bothering me, I have to take that moment and pause and say, okay, wait a minute, use your positive self-talk here. So it's something that takes time, but certainly is accessible and doable for children as young as 3 years old.
And worth it for all of us. I believe you would agree.
Our belief is that we're going to have a much healthier society when we have people who are more emotionally intelligent, for sure.
Dr. Mark Brackett from Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, thank you for coming back on the show. Thank you for your time tonight. We appreciate it. Coming up, Jim is back in the studio with another roundtable, but first, the 9 Network's Anne Marie Berger introduces us to a different kind of first aid.
Here, let me help you. Ready, set, go. Good girl.
When it comes to our kids, their physical well-being is of the utmost importance. We make sure their boo-boos have kisses and Band-Aids. When they're sick, we take them to the doctor.
It might be slippery. Be careful.
It's unthinkable for parents to let a physical ailment go untreated.
If they're bleeding, they need a Band-Aid. If they're crying, they need a hug. Just whatever I can do to physically make them feel better.
But what about the bruises that can't be seen? Well, there's a movement in St. Louis County to arm adults with the power to address these injuries and move past the stigma of mental health concerns.
Mental Health First Aid is a 12-hour training course, and it's for adults, usually 16 and up, to learn how to work with people who have mental health concerns. We know when people are maybe feeling down or blue and we don't know what to do, and so this is the idea of giving people skills to be able to help.
Chris Mayer is with Behavioral Health Response, a 24-hour crisis call center where individuals in crisis can speak to master-level clinicians and get connected to resources that can help.
If you're concerned about someone who may be struggling with depression, what do you think those signs would be? And what do you think the symptoms would be? And you can get
this year, BHR is funded by the St. Louis County Children's Service Fund to lead 48 mental health first aid classes.
Just the visual general sadness appearing, weight change.
So if you're in the St. Louis County, where you either work in St. Louis County, you live in St. Louis County, or you work with youth in some capacity, you can go to this training for free, but we have 48 that we're doing this year.
Problems with eating or sleeping, that you're sleeping too much.
This course is for anybody to improve listening and responding skills to help those who might have a mental health concern. Mental health first aid is especially important for those who live or work with young people. Addressing emotional concerns early or even before they start can possibly prevent mental health issues as an adult.
It addresses everything. It's that onset. You look at anxiety is 11, depression is high school age to college, psychosis is college age. Well, what if we caught it early on, right? So if I can help a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old who's struggling and give them the skills of, I don't know how to cope, I don't know how to speak up for myself, I don't know where to go when I'm having a challenge. Yeah, I think we're going to have adults that are going to be more well-rounded and they'll function better in society. If you went 22 years, if you're 11, you have anxiety and you go 22 years without getting support, you have a 33-year-old who still hasn't managed their anxiety and is now seeking treatment. How much better could their life have been? And how much more profitable, if you're going to talk about in dollars and cents, would they have been if they had gotten treatment earlier?
Turn around. You want to go back?
Carla Peretz is a mother of 3, and this issue is never far from her mind.
In addition to my daughter, Caroline, who's 4, I have a 7 and a 9-year-old boy, 2 other boys. And so, you know, sometimes the day I can feel like I've got 3 balls in the air and I'm trying to give everybody the attention that they need at the right time. And inevitably, bedtime seems to be when all the problems of the day come up. And I think about that a lot after I lay down myself. Was that a big problem? Was that something that really upset him, or was he trying to buy 5 minutes before he went to bed? And it's a balancing act, and I second guess myself all the time. You know, I want my children to be able to talk to me and more than anything feel comfortable with me so that communication line is open, but I second guess myself all the time that whether or not I've given them enough or solved their problems or have addressed it as a problem.
And joining us is Chris Mayer from Behavioral Health Response. You teach these mental health first aid classes to a lot of people. I think you mentioned in there 48 you've got coming up. It seems to me like such a simple idea that makes so much sense, so it's got to be more complicated than it seems. And I often wonder about these programs. It sounds so good. Do we know that it works, or do we know yet that it works?
We know based on what Australia has experienced that
And this
it
is where
works.
it came from. It was developed in Australia.
It was.
Right? Yeah.
And then Missouri and Maryland's Departments of Mental Health brought it to the States. So we started doing that about 2008. I was trained in 2009, and I can tell you from the emails I get from individuals who have attended the class, it's worked for them.
Yeah. What kind of emails? What are they telling you?
Well, it's really kind of interesting. I had one gentleman say, "Thank you for the training. My children say I listen more." You know, that alone is a big success. Doesn't mean it's a mental health concern, but at least he's open to the idea of that. But the best one I received as of late was a gentleman who works for St. Louis County government, not a clinician. And he says that, you know what, I look at employees differently. I look at people who come in differently. I look at the people in my church differently, my youth group differently, based on what I learned. And now I can model what it is to be able to say, I need some help, or here's where you can go for help. Because before he didn't have any idea of where to go.
And this is not just for youth mental health, this is mental health in general?
The idea is that it's for adults that work with youth, and we do trainings for adults as well, for adults with mental health concerns. But it's for anybody, because what happens is we talk about youth and we talk about anxiety. And I had a gentleman in the class this past weekend who said, that's me on that board. I'm 47 years old, and I realize the reason why I can't get my master's degree, why my relations aren't successful, that I have anxiety. Had no idea that's what it was holding him back since he was a child, and he could pinpoint when it started. I mean, that was an amazing moment to have him figure out that's what I need, and then we talked about what's your next steps.
Yeah, it seems to me that there would be a lot of, a very wide range of mental health issues.
Yes.
So you know, when you do first aid, you learn CPR and the Heimlich maneuver, and
yes.
And maybe how to stop bleeding with pressure and a tourniquet if it's necessary. Okay, beyond that,
yes.
You know, you're starting to be a doctor after that.
Right.
But that's basic first aid. It would seem to me that mental health first aid would be a lot more subtle than that.
But it's the same concept. We are the help that's available until more professional help arrive. So it's following a mnemonic device. They call it ALGE, where you ask about suicide or harm. We listen not judgmentally. We give reassurance and information, kind of normalizing what's experiencing. We're going to encourage appropriate professional help. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to take it, but you're going to plant that seed and say, you know, sometimes when people aren't sleeping or their eating habits are changing, there's some signs of depression. Perhaps we should talk about going to a counselor. And then we're going to encourage appropriate self-help strategies that they already are doing. I mean, it's something that we can take away. And really what it comes down to is being able to ask the question of, how can I help you?
Yeah, it seems to me as I was reading up on this,
Yes.
one of the things that came up was, at what point do you speak honestly to somebody and directly, as opposed to where we might, our initial sense might be we need to tiptoe around this. And there might be times when you need to ask directly, have you ever thought of committing suicide? Do you have a plan? Now, I don't know if that's something that I would do, say, as a teacher, or do I refer to a mental health professional?
Well, I can tell you if you take that course, whether you're with parents as teachers, or you're a security officer, you're a teacher in the schools, we teach you to ask that question. Because everybody needs to ask that question directly and openly, because we want to get the answer. If I'm not clear, and when I ask about suicide, then they can't answer that openly and honestly. And then they don't know if they can get the help from me that they need. It may just be like, I would ask you the question and you say, yes, I'm thinking of suicide. And I could tell you, I'm not sure what we're going to do next, but I'm going to be here to help you. And that might be involved calling the crisis line. That might be involved calling your doctor. If it's a youth, it might be calling a parent or another adult you trust.
How many people have taken this course? Have you trained?
Well, I can tell you, as of last year, we had trained 550 people, and this year, if we are on target, we'll train over 1,000 people. It's a
Great.
goal of getting people there to get this information out.
And Missouri a leader in this?
Missouri
this
and
area?
Maryland
Great.
work together, yes.
Great. Well,
Yes.
thanks for coming, Chris
Thank
Mayer.
you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, we're back in the studio, now back over at the table with our community table to get some perspective on tonight's topic. Let me do some quick introductions. First is Brandon Smith, a student here in St. Louis, also a local actor. Yes. And Court Sloger, welcome back to the show. We appreciate it, a communications professional. And Matt Strom with the Brain Drain Collective. Matt, when Margie, our producer, put out the call for the community table, multiple people wrote back and said, you've got to talk to Matt. We heard him at PKSTL. I guess if either of any of you can give us one sentence, what is PKSTL? I'll try.
It's 20 slides, 20 seconds, ideas, creativity, and connection.
It's a good place to be to learn new ideas and to meet new people, what's going on in the city. But anyway, you spoke at this event on this topic, and it clearly resonated with people. So I guess I'll just start by opening up this conversation by asking you to kind of catch us up on what you said that touched so many people.
So when I heard about the opportunity to give a presentation in front of a large group of people who are actively involved in the creative community, I thought that there was no topic better to present on than the prevalence of mental health concerns among creative people, because it's something that I think, I'm a professional creative. I do graphic design and web development. And among my colleagues and among my coworkers, it seems to be a common topic of very ginger conversation. So I thought it would be a great idea to talk in a very open forum about not only my personal experiences with mental health concerns, but also on my thoughts that the creative community is one that I think serves to benefit greatly from being open about mental health concerns, because not only are we a community that are the tool that we use to do our work, our mind, it needs to stay sharp and we need to stay healthy, but also our job is to communicate complex ideas to other people. So oftentimes we can really do a good job of presenting such a complex issue in a way that can be understood and be treated as very culturally normative.
Brandon, does that resonate with you in terms of the creative community dealing with this issue?
Yeah, it really does. Just like you're saying, having an awareness of things around you and being able to talk about it and address you, that is definitely a comforting environment to be around, to just be around different people and just, again, just talking about life and experiences, because art is one thing that is subjective and it can't be ridiculed, and it's something that brings people together because it's so much being offered at one time, and it helps people come together by having this different ideas.
I'd be interested to know, because you're an actor, what cases or examples of people using acting or stage art and performance to communicate ideas around mental health.
Oh, wow. Just something that's just having, like I said, having an experience and just being in the now as an actor. And we learn from looking at other people and addressing different situations, and by just having an awareness and following someone and just seeing how they act. And most actors, that's how we want to relate the most honest, the most truth to people. That's what actors do.
I think one of the reasons that art really resonates with people is because it allows us to take an idea and connect it to the human experience. And I think that the conversation about mental health is that it's a normative human experience to go through different ebbs and flows in mental health and how you feel, whether you're experiencing joy or grief or anxiety, and how we discuss that tends to be sort of this is normative, this is not normative, rather than thinking about it as sort of a spectrum, and helping people understand how they can understand their emotions and how they can understand their feelings, and also how you can translate that into action. So when somebody goes to rehab, for example, we teach them how to walk again, step by step, one step, next step. And it's very true for mental health. And how you get past mental health concerns, how you get better, is by taking it one step at a time. But a lot of times we tend to put it into a box or a constant state, or say, this is what a depressed person is like. This is what a person who suffers from addiction is like. Rather than seeing it as a dynamic, constantly changing, it's not an entire person's identity. It's something that they deal with. It's something that we all have to deal with in different ways. But our culture tends to make it something very static and fixed. And I think that one of the benefits of arts and creative people is that we can sort of relate that back to the human experience, so it isn't so isolating, so it isn't so immutable that people can't feel like they can't open up or move past it.
So thinking of all that you just said, all of that knowledge that you have now and that we have now on this topic tonight, look back at your childhood through that lens, and what do you see in terms of what you had and what you needed, or maybe what you wish you would have had?
Well, oftentimes we are taught to communicate certain ways with our parents, with our medical professionals. We sing songs as children about eating healthy and about sharing with our parents our feelings, and you're taught, in picture books about doctors and going to the doctor. And so, a lot of popular children's characters go to the doctor, and it's how to see a doctor and talk to a doctor can be a scary thing, but we teach our children to know that it's for the best and it's for their health, and it's because we care about them. We don't talk to children about seeing a therapist, or we talk to children about taking medicine and how it's good for you, but we don't talk to children about taking antidepressants or things like that later in their life they may deal with. And because we miss this opportunity to, at an early age, teach them that it's for their health and it's because we care about them and it's not a scary thing, and everybody goes to the doctor.
So is your generation going to miss this opportunity, or are you talking about mental health differently than your parents' generation?
I think so. Yeah, I think it will definitely change, basically from the youth, just for things I think that education is going to be changed anyway, how we address, like what he's saying, different topics in our schools, and I can see that changing, definitely.
I think our parents' generation tend to, again, sort of wanting to hide things away, like not wanting to talk about mental health issues. It's, they're the family secrets, they're the dark things that we don't want to talk about. And I think now there's a greater push towards empowerment, not only how to empower individuals, but how to empower entire families to realize that their family dynamic depends upon the actions of individuals and the mental health of all the members of the family. And so I think having those conversations within the family to say, let's open up, let's talk openly about this. What can we do as a family to work through these issues, as opposed to saying, let's just ignore this. This is something that we can't talk about.
And thank you for all of your time. We appreciate it. And speaking of empowering, we do want to highlight some resources that are available. Let's do that now.
And joining me is Dara Glick, who's with the Washington University Child and Adolescent Psychology Center. As we've been listening to some of the conversations here, you've been shaking your head, you've been agreeing, or maybe wondering if you would have said it differently. I'd like to start out stepping back as we kind of try to wrap this up. We've talked a lot about what the challenges are, a lot about what the problems are, but it would seem to me, if we compare where we are today on these issues to where we might have been 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, we must be making great strides, not just in treatment, but in awareness.
I think so. I think stigma can only exist with two necessary ingredients, and that's silence and separateness. And I think we have made remarkable strides in decreasing that. So whether it's the people who are here today who discuss openly what their experiences are, that breaks, silence. It also breaks the idea that mental illness happens to someone else. It's not something that happens to someone you don't know. It's actually your loved ones. It's the people in your life. And when we step away from that, then we mobilize. And you're right, we have good treatments that work. And when we were talking today, the stunning statistic of 60% of kids experiencing trauma made me start thinking, if we can't avoid the traumas, how do we turn that into a remarkable strength and a source of strength? And I think we are moving towards being able to do that.
That's the difference between prevention, which could be worked out in certain areas. Absolutely. If you can identify that. But you're not going to prevent everything, right? So then we're not stuck with, but we're challenged with what do we do with that 60%, even if we lower it to 55.
Right. And have you ever heard of the term single charismatic adult?
I have not.
It is a really interesting term, and it's a really neat research concept. So when they looked at kids who'd experienced unbelievable trauma, what they found is the kids who really did well often pointed out one single charismatic, engaging adult that cared what happened to them. Could be a teacher, could be a family member, could be someone. And I think that is the most concrete thing we can do, is be a charismatic adult for a kid that's in need. So at a community level, that can be advocating in the same way that Chad's Coalition does. And in a personal way, it can be saying something when you see a child in distress and telling them you care. You're on their side. You're willing to stay until it gets worked out.
Is it when we started out talking about Oklahoma and Joplin and Newtown and places like that, these terrible traumatic situations with losses, people who have lost kids, who have lost parents, who have survived, is it that much different than a child who has lost a parent, not in a tornado, but to cancer, or lost parents through divorce? Are there similarities there? Or are they just totally different sorts of approaches to things?
I think you're always going to come into that beautiful constellation of the individual. So I think there are things we can learn about traumatic experiences, but it'll always be a matter of bringing it back to what that one child needs, what that one person needs. And part of that is having enough resources that we can really do the individualized things that each of those people need. So I think we can learn from it, and then we're going to try to work our way back so that it's exactly what that one individual needs.
Great. Thanks so much, Dara Glick. We're going to try to wrap things up here in just a moment. So thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you. Absolutely.
The show kind of flew by tonight, so we have the post-show. Stick around. Ed Reggie can tell us how to get to that in just a second. But we're going to start the post-show on the show, and really what we're going to do here is pick up some of the topics that we didn't get enough time to talk about. And we were just chatting a second ago. this idea of stigma. This is not just folks of a different generation that don't have the same perspective as young and hip, cool people do. This is a stigma is an issue across different generations. Would you say all of you?
Yes. Well, I think personally that stigma is the largest barrier, and that if you compare, we were talking before the show, if you compare physical illness, if somebody has a cold, they go to the doctor, they have a cold, they get treated for the cold. Nobody cares that they have a cold. Maybe you don't want to shake their hand without using Germ-X, and they're carrying tissues. And yet, when somebody has a mental health issue, there's some sort of a fear about staying away from them. We don't want to talk about them. We want to wait to diagnose. We don't want to get them help. We don't focus on prevention early enough, like the man said from Yale, that we don't focus on that early enough, so that we're always kind of running backwards, back at ourselves, I think, after something's already happened.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the stigma definitely plays out, thank you, in that sense that we have not done a real good job as a culture in preparing our kids in terms of prevention. We see it in mental health, we see it in alcohol and drug abuse. The federal government recently came out with a whole new strategy on alcohol and drugs, and it's heavily focused on prevention. So obviously, the feds are seeing the need for it. We've been talking about it at the National Council for years that we have to work at the front end of this problem, that it makes sense, it's logical. So I'm heartened that we're going to start making greater strides and efforts in that area, because I think it's imperative.
Are the cures as effective? And I think maybe this is the thing, that people think the cures aren't as effective as medical cures are for medical conditions, that it's kind of softer.
Well, along those lines, when it comes to addiction, there's really a movement, recovery advocacy movement right now for more people who are in recovery, long-term recovery, like myself, 32 years sober, to be open about it and say, look, I had this problem when I was young, I put it behind me. We need to do that. We need to be open about it, because then it normalizes recovery. People realize, oh, that guy's in long-term recovery, I have the problem, I can get help too.
Well, and I think also along those same lines, when you talk about the cure being softer, I think that we hear a lot about medical conditions where two people will have the same treatment. For cancer, for example, somebody will have the same treatment. One person gets better and has great success, and one person doesn't. And yet, we would never say to a person who doesn't have success, you already did that, you can't do it again. We would never deny them access to care. We would never cut them off, or say, oh, those treatments just aren't valuable anymore. But we would continue to do research and talk about those things. So I think we need to begin to look at our mental health in that same way.
Just as health in general, I suppose.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about how to better educate children and how to, better prepare them for dealing with these issues in their, later life. But another thing that I think we need to talk about is leading by example. And it's not a generational issue. The different generations deal with mental health issues, all their own, and they share similar issues between generations. So if we start approaching, mental health and being open about it and fighting the cultural stigma among people of our generation, whatever generation we may be, then our children and our peers and our elders can look to us as examples. That, I think, is just as important.
I do think we need to talk about the practical implications of stigma and what happens, if people are diagnosed, they're afraid if they get diagnosed, and that will carry with them for the rest of their lives. And so then it will affect whether or not they get health insurance, whether or not their health insurance premiums will rise, whether or not their employers will see them through this new lens, whether or not their romantic or their friend partners will see them through this lens. And these are very real concerns and barriers. It's not just the stigma of the way we talk about it, but just how a person experiences life and things they have to deal with. And they may say, I'd really like to be open about it, I'd like to talk more about this, but I'm making these choices, and these are much more hard choices I have to make, but that's what I'm going to do in order to preserve my insurance or to protect myself from discrimination.
But there's also cultural issues that we haven't talked about. And I can tell you from the training, I've trained with consumers who are in recovery, but I've also trained with people where 24 of the people in the room did not speak English as their first language. And in their culture is not accepted, but they're also told when they become a citizen that when people ask you how you are, you tell them you're fine no matter what. So if that's the message we're giving people and their own culture doesn't even have words to define what's going on, we're not doing a very good job. So yes, it's big. And it's one of those things that I'm so glad we did this program, but it's an ongoing challenge that we're all very dedicated to fix, at least work towards it in our community.
Okay, I know you have more to say, so don't let me interrupt. But there were a lot of things that came up. So the stigma is there even for, say, a college student and a post-college student.
Oh yeah, I mean, and we've heard earlier today about the issues that college students are facing now, where they oftentimes feel like they have to choose between their mental health and the success that they've been encouraged to achieve. So I think that right now there are issues to be addressed from early childhood on up through primary education and secondary education. There are individual challenges there that definitely need to be addressed, but the entire time, and often in my own experiences, the experience that I've had, the biggest resource for me is my peers. And finding people in my peer group who have gone through the same things, who can be open and receptive to what I'm going through. So by encouraging people to look in their peer group for resources, and then also look outside for resources, but then also be resources to other people, to encourage, I'm, current, like with the Pachacta PKSTL presentation that I gave, was hoping to encourage people to be resources to each other. And maybe you haven't had an experience with mental health issues. Maybe you can't share an experience that you've been through treatment or you've seen a therapist, but you can at least say, I understand that this is something that is totally normal, and I'm not going to treat you differently because you have had an experience like that.
I think that's the whole premise behind mental health first aid, is that the more people that we can educate, the more people that understand, the more people that know not only what they're looking for, but how to respond appropriately, or if they don't know how to respond appropriately, how to go to somebody who does. I think that makes all the difference, in the world. And I also think that stigma, what you said about stigma is interesting. As a person also in long-term recovery, I have kids who are high schoolers, and the last thing they want is their mom to be on the show, and yet they want it at the same time. So
we have to leave it there. Let me interrupt, but we'll continue the conversation online. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned online.
What are the issues that are important to you and to the St. Louis region? Share your insights. We want your ideas for a future episode of Stay Tuned. Call 314-5...
I'll use the time on the web to start by apologizing to Jean Sikora, whom I did not introduce earlier. So my apologies. Thank you for being here. School Teams Liaison, Preferred Family Healthcare. Excellent insights. Thank you. And oversight on my part. Do we want to do any more personal stories? Dan, do you know how to start this kind of a meeting that we can make everyone talk personally?
Well, I'm going to throw something out because I've been wondering about this. Everybody said in my generation kids were traumatized by dealing with the fear of nuclear war. Okay. Personally, I wasn't, but I understand that maybe some kids were. But it was a generational thing, that it was something that generation dealt with. And I'm wondering, you guys were talking about generational issues, and Dan, you see differences in generations. But I just wonder if people have different experiences that come maybe from generational differences.
Well, when I was in 6th grade, my teacher told me that...
Grab the mic.
When I was in 6th grade, my teacher told us that we probably wouldn't live a full life because we'd be annihilated from a nuclear war. And as I got a little older and I looked back on it, I thought, this has something to do with how I've approached life.
I mean, that's
I finally figured out he was wrong.
That falls into the 60% of traumatic experiences.
Yeah, but I mean, it stuck with me, right?
Yeah.
I'm this, old guy, and I'm still talking about it.
Right.
So obviously, I think kids today, a lot of them have fears of, am I going to have a job? Is the economy going to straighten out, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak personally to that. I graduated from college 4 years ago, and when the economy was absolutely just, I mean, I just remember sitting and going through like interview processes and sitting in a coffee shop and just seeing the stock market plummet and kind of really worrying about, am I going to be able to find a job? And with the rising cost of education and the rising, the high unemployment rates now, college graduates are having such a hard time finding work despite being told that they're the best educated, that they've had all these resources their entire life. We grew up in a time of, a boom time. We were at school, our parents told us that we could go to the best colleges and get the best jobs. And then we're coming out of college and finding that not to be true. And there's a very big issue among people my age, and I talk to my friends every day about it, is that anxiety over, you're expected, because you went to a great school, because you spent your entire life thinking about that job after college, you're expected to have it, and you don't. How do you rectify those two things?
Well, and I think you see that in, because I do have 2 high schoolers and I work in high schools all the time, you see that really trickling down and affecting high schoolers as well, because they're watching you. Mm-hmm. And they're saying, okay, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be so successful and get great grades and do all this and then pick the best school and invest in this education, and the people who are just a step ahead of me, that isn't working for them. So I'm seeing a lot of that just in my day-to-day work as well. It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. But I also think
Yeah, grab the mic. Thanks,
just
Dan.
to kind of piggyback on both comments. One, I think we have to also remember this is a generation, well, not necessarily this generation, but we have the 9/11 aftermath, right? The fear. And when we think about Syria and other countries, we're talking about nuclear issues now. And so not that they are told in as clear terms as you were, hopefully not. But I do think they're living in that atmosphere of fear. And then also to connect in a way to what you were saying, in the psychology world, we talk about emerging adulthood, this idea that we prolonged adolescence, possibly to 24, possibly even later in the 20s. And so there's something that's happening, even though we're holding kids to these expectations, whether explicitly or not, they're feeling it. We've, in a way, kind of prolonged people's debut into being a full-fledged adult. And how do those things contradict?
I think listening to all this really reminds,
Yeah, you're good.
You're good. I'm good. But this generation had this problem. This generation had this problem. I'm pretty sure like the 14th century had their own generational problems of fear and anxiety. I think that this is honestly just, it's an aspect of the human condition, that mental health concerns are normative human concerns, and that the issue is we need to start having conversations to allow people to realize this is normative behavior. Concerns over your mental health are something that everyone deals with. Each generation has its own unique challenges. Every family has unique challenges. And rather than making it something that is kind of outside of our locus of control, but rather that this is something that everyone at this table here has had moments where they've been anxious or scared or they've been insecure, and how do they work past that process, and how do we teach those skills, because these are life skills. This isn't like, these are human skills. Yeah, right. This is not something that is outside of ourselves.
I'm just curious.
There's something that's really key, and it's really important. Actually, some of the experiences we have are not normal human experiences. They're only normal the last 20 or 30 years. So if you look at our biology, we have 1 million-year-old biology, and our stress response and our coping responses are really geared around much more primal situations. Things are very different now. When you think about it, things that we used to react to, you either fought or you fled. Most of the problems that we face in our day-to-day life, you cannot fight or fly from.
Especially if you're a child.
Especially if you're a child, they don't have as much control over them. And other things that have changed, our bodies haven't changed, but culturally, socially, we're changing at an exponential rate. Yeah. One of the biggest differences that we see, Jim, when you talk about the nuclear crisis, we all remember what it was like. What's so different now is the level of exposure we have to the threats and traumas. You cannot get away. Our kids are on phones, they're on the internet, they're on the TV, they're bombarded with images and messages, and those messages are twofold. Our kids get messages of two kinds that that tear them up. One is that everybody else is rich and successful and has a wonderful life. Right? So happiness is not a constant fixed state. Happiness is relative. And when they do happiness studies, what they find is that if you are in a better place than the people around you, you're happier and you feel good about yourself. So if you're making $100,000 and the people around you are making 50, you feel really good about yourself. But if you're making $100,000 and everybody around you is making $1 million, you feel inadequate and you don't feel as good.
Wait a second. Where are these children that are making $100,000?
On TV and on the internet and on their phones. The other side of this.
Startups, they're doing IT
Oh,
startups.
right.
There's a kid on the internet that made $1 million in stocks. I get that ad all the time. The other side of this is the level of trauma and fear. So kids also, the world is super scary. The world is much scarier than it was when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we would go outside and we would play. We'd be gone all day. We might check in at lunch. We'd come in when it was dark, right?
Yeah.
Now parents, because I've seen this with my daughter. So they heard about a kid that got kidnapped. The young ladies that were kidnapped and held in Cleveland. Now this has been going on forever. These aren't new things, but the level of attention. So I have my 9-year-old daughter looking at me with eyes like, this happens. And so they're so much more aware of the bad things because they're saturated with it. So we've got this duality of flooded with all the success and the wonderment of life that you may or may not be a part of, and most of us aren't a part of that high level of financial success.
This might seem silly, and tell me if it is, but it seems to me that one of the things in medicine now is that we're protecting children from exposure to bacteria and germs that they need to have some resistance. I wonder if we're doing the same thing with coping mechanisms by protecting kids so much, exposing them limited exposure to real life experiences, and then they can't deal with it.
Well, I can remember back when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. It's the first time I ever saw anything bad on a mass level, because everybody's we're watching the TV show because there's a teacher on it.
Yeah.
I remember that being in middle school, and you didn't see before. That was the first time I remember seeing something because we all wanted to watch it. And that experience, I would say, shaped my generation in some ways. But I think that a lot of times we're reacting out of fear because we don't know what's next. And it's kind of like when my daughter had a girlfriend over and they said, well, how come she didn't know about what happened in Boston? And I said, well, I wasn't really ready to talk to her about it. Well, I watched the news, she had all this information, and I had to be at a good place to be able to talk about it that would be safe for both of us.
Well, that's, I think, a key thing. When Bart and I were just talking back there during some of the other interviews about some of the visuals from Oklahoma. And I was saying to him that I was watching, teachers carrying children out of the school, and I said, I'm 52 years old and I never want to go in an elementary school again as long as I live, was my first response, and if I don't, as an adult professional social worker who works in the mental health field, know exactly how to handle that situation, I'm being bombarded with that media, how then am I supposed to help my own children or other kids deal with that as well? So I think we have an expectation sometimes on the adults around us as well, that we just have an inherent coping mechanism.
And on that note, we've run out of stream time on the web. So that we'll leave it with a question and kind of back where we started the night on that topic. Thanks, guys, for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. Good job, everybody. Thanks for watching.